Lou here, and our topic today is video game development a young person's game? This was asked originally on Quora, although the person asked, is it a young man's game? And the answer is yes, but maybe not for the reasons you think. The general reason is young people are willing to handle unfortunate conditions of game development employment more than older people are willing to. It's still the case that older, more experienced people are like to be better at the job. Experience really does count, but here's the details. The employment conditions are poor. Game development is traditionally an occupation with long hours, lowish pay, and lots of stress during crunch time when employees can work 60 or 70 hours a week for 6 weeks or even for many months. Consequently, many people leave the industry after a time with the conventional notion being that it's 5 years on average. So, developers tend to be young people who haven't yet decided to leave game development for more stable, more lucrative, and more comfortable jobs. There are lots of individual exceptions, of course, and those are frequently the people who are in charge, who often aren't good managers because they're game developers, not managers, and hence we see things like the crunch time because they haven't reasonably estimated the length of the job, or they haven't been able to fight off interference from publishers who want to add features but not give any more time to do the job. The industry is also stricken with job instability. In general these days, of course, really secure jobs are hard to find, but insecure jobs are the norm in the video game industry. Studios can be closed even if they've been successful. That might be because big companies do funny things, or it might be because even though the studio has been producing good games, they haven't contracted to make a new game, so they don't have any cash inflow, and they have to shut down the studio. I know one designer who designed 5 or 6 video games and quit the industry because he was tired of companies disappearing under him. He went into education. Of course, we have something like 500 schools in the United States alone producing graduates and dropouts from game development programs. And the dropouts drop out often because they get a job. Many of these people become independent game makers, often because they can't get a job in an established company because they have no experience or there are no openings. Some, perhaps many indies, work for nothing in order to make their dream game. And they have to make small games in order to finish in a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, it's a tough life because small games don't make much money. The mean revenue per game on Apple's store is $6,000, and the median is only about $500. So there are as many make more than $500 as make less than $500. Well, there's no living there, is there? Because these games take months to make. And it's likely worse on Android, where people are less willing in general to pay money for apps. Now, young people are better able to cope with these conditions, more willing to cope with these conditions. Often it's because they're not married or they don't yet have children. But many of them, after some time as indies, become disillusioned. They find a real job in order to make a living. And that leaves us again with young people in most of the indie situations. Now, the general problem here is the employee supply is much greater than the demand, so it's probably just about inevitable that working conditions are poor. When you have lots of skilled people who are eager, nay, enthusiastic to work in video games, and not many jobs open, or at least jobs that offer a living wage, then naturally employers have no incentive to treat the employees well. Because if one leaves, there's always more wanting the job. I'm not saying that makes long-range sense, because I don't think it does. But video game production is a very short-range industry. Nobody looks beyond really the end of the next game. Some people would say that coding is a young person's activity, but I think there are lots of older coders who would disagree. Of course, many of the older coders have moved up to become software designers and don't do so much coding or any coding. As with most jobs, those with experience tend to be better at it than those without much experience. When is this going to change? The IGDA tries hard to promote working conditions. That's the International Game Development Association. But there's not a lot they can do. As long as there's this boundless enthusiasm for making games and this big supply of graduates of game development schools, then the supply-demand equation is going to rule. Add to that there's a tendency for electronic goods, ones that are not tangible, to decrease in price over time. There's too much piracy, too many rock-bottom sales. We could go into the details, but the fact is games sell for less now than they used to, and they don't get much respect from people. People don't expect to pay much for a game anymore. They have been trained to expect games to be really cheap. Well, what does this do for the companies that make games? It means there's less money available and the employees have to work harder and sacrifice, which makes the conditions worse. I don't see any desirable change coming. If anything, it could get worse. So all these factors tend to make game development a young person's activity, not because they're better at it, but because they're more willing to tolerate the poor conditions.